Close your eyes and conjure the most famous villain in wrestling history. The platinum blonde hair. The $1,000 robe dragging along the floor behind him. The slow, preening strut down the aisle, nose in the air, smirking at a crowd that has paid good money for the privilege of hating him. The figure-4 leglock screwed onto a howling opponent. The interview where he looks you dead in the eye and informs you that he is better than you, your town, and everyone you have ever loved. You are picturing Ric Flair, and you are wrong. You are picturing a man Ric Flair spent his entire career studying and copying. Every last detail of that image was dreamed up by a Camden, New Jersey police officer named Herman Gustav Rode Jr., who wrestled as Nature Boy Buddy Rogers. The bleached hair was his invention. The strut was his. The robes were his. The figure-4 leglock was his. The boastful, sneering, I am the greatest interview style that every loudmouth villain has leaned on for 6 decades was his. Flair did not merely borrow the nickname. He took the whole blueprint, right down to the finishing hold, and admitted as much gladly his entire life. Now the numbers. On June 30th, 1961, Rogers pulled 38,622 people into a baseball stadium in Chicago, setting attendance and gate records that would go unbroken for more than 20 years. He carried the National Wrestling Alliance World title for 573 days, the longest any villain had ever held it. He became the very first man crowned Worldwide Wrestling Federation champion, which makes this strutting peacock the original foundational title holder of the company that today calls itself WWE. And he is one of only 4 men in history to hold both of those world championships, a list that otherwise reads Ric Flair, AJ Styles, and Cody Rhodes. By the agreement of the men who actually watched him work, he was the first true total package the business ever produced. The look, the physique, the personality, the move, the mouth, all in one man. So how did a Camden cop named Herman Rode become the template for every flashy villain who ever lived? He was born Herman Gustav Rode Jr. on February 20th, 1921, in Camden, New Jersey, the son of German immigrants. There was nothing glamorous about the start of it. Camden was a hard industrial shipping town, and the Rhodes were working class down to the floorboards. His father died while Herman was still a teenager, and the boy went to work to help keep his widowed mother afloat. What he possessed from the very beginning was a body. While other kids his age were just getting by, young Herman was wrestling at the local YMCA, where he won the heavyweight championship of the Camden League. He had the kind of natural build that no gym can manufacture and no costume can fake, broad and powerful and perfectly proportioned, a frame that looked sculpted rather than grown, and he carried something even rarer than muscle. He had presence. When he walked into a room, eyes followed. At 17, restless and hungry to use what he had, he ran off to join a traveling circus, taking on all comers in the exhibition tents, learning the difference between a real fight and a performance a paying crowd would actually open its wallet for. That single distinction would become the heart of his genius. When the Second World War came, he served in the Navy. When he came home, he took the most unremarkable job a man could find. He pinned on a badge as a police officer in Camden, married a local woman, and lived a few blocks from where he had grown up, walking a beat. Read that twice. The man who would become the most flamboyant performer his sport ever produced, the inventor of arrogance as a marketable art, began his adult life as a uniformed cop waving traffic through a blue-collar New Jersey intersection. But the YMCA mats had never let go of him, and neither had the circus tents. He trained under a seasoned old professional named Fred Grobmere, and somewhere in that quiet, unglamorous start, a man with the body of a statue and the instincts of a born showman began to sense that the police uniform was the costume, and the wrestling ring was where his real self had been waiting all along. He broke into the business right at the end of the 1930s, wrestling under his own name and then under the flat ring name Dutch Rogers. For years, he was a journeyman, a fine body with natural charisma and not much polish, taking his bruises in small halls across New Jersey, New York, and Philadelphia, working for crooked booking agents in a trade where the backstage knife fighting was often more dangerous than anything that happened in the ring. He clicked with crowds almost at once, but he was still nobody. He was raw material. His first real signal that he might be something more came when he beat the legendary Ed Strangler Lewis, one of the most respected names in the whole history of the sport. Going over a man like that, even in a worked match, meant the people who ran wrestling had spotted something in him worth protecting. Then came Texas around 1944, and the transformation kicked into gear. He adopted a catchier name, lifting it from a movie star of the day, and became Buddy Rogers. He bleached his hair to platinum. He cultivated a deep, year-round tan. He billed himself as the Atomic Blonde. Step by step, he was learning that in this business the marketing could matter as much as the wrestling, and maybe more. The last and most important piece fell into place in Columbus, Ohio. A promoter named Jack FIFA looked at this bleached, strutting, arrogant peacock and handed him a nickname. First it was the Natural Guy, then it sharpened into the Nature Boy, borrowed from a haunting hit of the era, the song Nat King Cole, made famous about a strange enchanted boy. The name was perfect, pretty and faintly eerie, and utterly unlike the gruff, no-nonsense brand every other wrestler was peddling. And in those same years he developed the move that would outlive him by generations, a leg twist submission he called the Figure 4 Grapevine, soon known the world over as the Figure 4 Leglock. It looked like it bent a man's knees the wrong direction. It looked like it hurt. He made the crowd believe it hurt, and then he made them believe the poor soul trapped inside it had earned every agonizing second. The clay had a shape at last, and the shape was a villain unlike anything the business had ever sold. The brand new medium about to sweep across America was about to carry him into every living room in the country. In the early 1950s, television arrived, and wrestling was among the very first things it put on the air. The networks needed cheap, dramatic, easy-to-follow programming, and two men grappling under bright lights fit the bill exactly. Wrestling became a staple of the young medium, and the young medium was hunting for a star. It found Buddy Rogers, broadcast out of Chicago on the old Dumont network, and the country had never laid eyes on anything like him. Understand what wrestlers had been before he came along. They were tough, tight-lipped, serious men who presented themselves as legitimate athletes. They did not brag. They did not preen. They let their records speak. Rogers ripped that rulebook to confetti. He strutted. He posed. He flaunted his bleached hair and his tan and his robes at audiences who had only ever seen working men in plain trunks. And when an interviewer pushed a microphone toward him, he did not offer a word of respect for his opponent. He boasted. He sneered. He told the people at home that the men he beat were pathetic, beneath him, unworthy of sharing his air. After one of his biggest wins, he seized the microphone, stared into the camera, and crowed, "To a nicer guy, it couldn't happen." It became his signature line. It was arrogance refined into a weapon, and the audience reacted exactly as he wanted. They did not simply dislike him. They ached to watch him lose. They bought tickets, drove for hours, and jammed arenas for one purpose only, to pray that tonight, at long last, somebody would finally shut his mouth. That is the invention. That is the gift he handed the business that it had never owned before, the heel you pay to hate, the villain whose purpose is not to be admired, but to be despised, and whose worth is measured precisely by how desperately the crowd wants to see him beaten. And he guarded that illusion with a real menace the cartoon Strut kept hidden. There is a story, retold for decades, that when a reporter had the gall to ask him to his face whether professional wrestling was fake, Rogers replied by sinking him into the figure four and cranking it until the man's knee gave way. True or exaggerated, the legend tells you everything about how seriously he took the character. The peacock in the robe was selling a fantasy, and he would hurt you to keep it real. Even the young woman who worked early in the 1950s as his valet, a performer who would one day become the most famous woman in the sport under the name Moolah, learned that the charm and the ruthlessness lived inside the same skin. But here is the wall, and it is an odd one because it had nothing to do with the crowd. The crowd belonged to him. The problem was everyone else in the locker room. Rogers's flashy act and the political muscle that came with his box office pull made the other wrestlers seether. They wrote him off as a fraud, more performer than grappler. They believed he used his backstage clout to bury men he disliked. And in a brutal, secretive trade full of men who could genuinely maim one another, that resentment was not idle gossip. It was a loaded gun aimed at his career and eventually at his body. What lifted Rogers from regional television novelty to national force was that he did not simply perform. He understood the whole machine, and he reached out and grabbed the controls. Wrestling in that age was sliced into territories, regional kingdoms run by promoters who guarded their turf like warlords. A headliner in one city might be a stranger in the next. Rogers broke that law. He could draw money in Chicago, in St. Louis, in Montreal, in Boston, across the Northeast. Anywhere a promoter dared book him. He was one of the only attractions in the entire business who could travel and sell out everywhere he landed, and that made him something more dangerous than a wrestler. It made him a power broker. When a rival promotion in the Big St. Louis market threw him against the respected champion Louthed as a counter-attraction, Rogers drew so heavily that he forced the feuding promotions to merge, and he walked out the other side, controlling a slice of the Midwest as a booker. He sold out Chicago's 11,000-seat arena on a regular basis. He learned the business end cold, who drew money and who did not, how to build heat, how to send a crowd home gnashing to buy a ticket for the following week. He strung together one of the longest sustained runs as a top draw the sport has ever seen, roughly 15 years at or near the summit. But that same climb exposed the side of him his enemies loathed. Louthed, soon to be his great rival, said Rogers lived by a private creed, a chilling little scrap of philosophy. Be cruel to your friends and kind to your enemies, so that your enemies become your friends. And then you can be cruel to them too. Whether or not Thesh had the wording exactly right, it captured how the locker room saw him. A brilliant performer, a superb showman, and a calculating schemer who would step on anyone in his path to the top. By 1961, the political tides that had long held him back finally swung his way. The most powerful body in the sport, the National Wrestling Alliance, was at last prepared to do something it had never once done. It was prepared to strap its most prestigious prize, the World Heavyweight Championship, around the waist of a strutting, sneering, bleached blonde villain. For the very first time, the bad guy was about to be king. To grasp the height of the mountain Rogers scaled, you have to understand the man already standing on its peak. Because that man was the exact opposite of everything Rogers represented. His name was Pat O'Connor, the reigning NWA World Champion, a clean-cut, technically gifted grappler out of New Zealand, precisely the kind of legitimate, respectable athlete the title had always belonged to. O'Connor was what the establishment believed a world champion ought to be. Rogers was the thing the establishment had spent its entire existence keeping away from that belt. This was not merely a match. It was a referendum on what wrestling was about to become. June 30th, 1961. Comiskey Park, Chicago, a baseball stadium. And they came. 38,622 people surged through the gates, a crowd so vast it set attendance and gate records no wrestling event in America would top for more than 2 decades. Sit with that scale. Years later, when Hulk Hogan was packing domes, he was still chasing a bar this strutting villain had planted in a ballpark back in 1961. The match was a best-of-3 falls war. Rogers took the first fall with the figure 4, folding O'Connor's legs as the enormous crowd roared. He surrendered the second, and in the deciding fall, he beat the establishment's golden boy and strutted off with the most prestigious championship in wrestling wrapped around his waist. He grabbed the microphone, the whole stadium boiling over, and fed them the line. To a nicer guy, it couldn't happen. The villain was the world champion. The blueprint was finished. What followed was a reign of 573 days, longer than any heel had ever held that title. Every territory wanted him, because every territory's hometown hero earned a payday and a sold-out building by challenging the despised Nature Boy. Promoters who had spent their whole careers crowning humble, respectable champions suddenly grasped the arithmetic. A hero the crowd merely admired moved some tickets, but a villain the crowd genuinely loathed emptied the box office. Night after night, Rogers was living proof that hatred was the more profitable emotion. He was the single most valuable attraction in the sport. And that was exactly the moment it began to come apart. Because Buddy Rogers had spent 15 years collecting enemies, and now those enemies arrived to collect from him. It started in a dressing room in Columbus, Ohio. 2 legitimately dangerous wrestlers, Bill Miller and Carl Gotch, men who truly resented Rogers' arrogance and his backstage power, cornered him and broke his arm. Not in a match, in the locker room, a real assault by his own colleagues. Then, up in Montreal, the feared Killer Kowalski broke his leg in the ring. The most glamorous man in wrestling was being physically taken apart by the very peers who despised his act. And the men who ran the National Wrestling Alliance, watching their champion accumulate injuries and enemies, came to a decision. They wanted the belt off him, and they wanted it on Lou Tesh, the respectable old guard, the man who openly held Rogers in contempt. The catch was that nobody entirely trusted Rogers to lose on purpose. So the promoter built a cage of safeguards around the bout. It would be a single fall rather than the customary best-of-3, to choke off Rogers' room to improvise. And every champion of that era had to post a $25,000 bond, an enormous sum held by the Alliance for the length of his reign. Rogers got the warning plainly: cooperate or kiss the bond goodbye to charity. On January 24, 1963, in Toronto, Rogers dropped the title to Tesh, and that one title change split the entire wrestling world down the middle. Because the powerful promoters of the Northeast, Vincent J. McMahon and Toots Mondt, did not believe Lou Tesh could draw a dime in their territory. They wanted their man, the box office magnate, the Nature Boy, so they did something radical. They tore up their membership in the National Wrestling Alliance and launched their own company, the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. And they crowned a champion. To explain how he had supposedly won it, they invented a tournament in Rio de Janeiro that never happened, handed Rogers a brand new belt on television, and proclaimed him the first Worldwide Wrestling Federation world champion. Sit with the weight of that. The company born from that split, the company that exists because promoters wanted Buddy Rogers as their champion, is the outfit known today as WWE. The original title holder, the cornerstone of the largest wrestling empire on earth, is this strutting Camden cop. Every WrestleMania, every billion-dollar television contract, traces its lineage back through a chain of champions to a single man, and that man is Buddy Rogers. But the reign that launched an empire barely lasted a month, because the body his enemies had been steadily breaking was about to give out on him completely. Sometime in the spring of 1963, Buddy Rogers felt his chest begin to tighten. By the account his side told for the rest of his life, he suffered a heart attack. The man who had been the most durable, most glamorous physical specimen in the sport, the body chiseled like a monument, was suddenly a 42-year-old whose own heart was turning against him. His new bosses, McMahon and Mont, slipped into a quiet panic. Their brand new company stood entirely on this champion, and that champion's heart was failing. They needed the title off him in a hurry, onto someone strong, someone reliable, someone who could shoulder the company for years to come. They settled on a powerfully built young hero named Bruno Sammartino, and on May 17, 1963, inside Madison Square Garden, the reign of the original Nature Boy ended in 48 seconds, less than a minute. The man who had headlined stadiums, who had drawn 38,000 to a ballpark, was pinned almost before the bell had finished ringing, and a new hero was crowned in his place. And here is where the story refuses to settle cleanly, the way the best ones rarely do. Rogers always swore the heart attack was genuine, that he was hauled into that ring weeks after a real medical emergency, that his body simply had nothing left, and he knew the end had come. Bruno Sammartino, who lived for decades afterward and stayed sharp nearly to the end, told a colder version, that Rogers faked the heart attack to wriggle out of a low-paying card, that he was wrestling every day right up to that match, and that when Rogers got cold feet about losing, Bruno looked him in the eye in the middle of the garden and offered him the choice. The easy way or the hard way. We will likely never know. There is no film of the match. The records are long gone. Two proud men told two different stories until the day each of them died. But peel away the dispute and look at the human being at the center of it. Whatever the truth, this was the end. The most influential performer his sport had ever produced. The man who drew the blueprint, watched his 15-year run at the top evaporate in 48 seconds in front of the very crowd he had taught to despise him. The peers he had schemed against had broken his arm and his leg, and now, whether from his heart or from the politics, he was done. The strut was over. After the Garden, Buddy Rogers all but vanished. For years he surfaced only in fragments. A brief tag match here, a minute-long singles bout there, often perched on the ring apron while a partner did the real labor, his battered body no longer able to do what it once had. The most famous villain in wrestling dimmed into a ghost. And then, in 1979, he returned for the single most important cameo of his life. By then, a new Nature Boy had risen in the business. A young, brash, bleached blonde grappler named Ric Flair had climbed the ranks in the Mid-Atlantic territory, and he had built his entire identity on Buddy Rogers. The robes were Rogers's. The strut was Rogers's. The bleached hair, the arrogant promos, the figure-4 leg lock, every bit of it lovingly lifted from the original. Flair idolized him. So they put the two Nature Boys in a ring together. The Battle of the Nature Boys, the master against the student, the original against the heir. And in Greensboro, North Carolina, the young pretender locked the old king in the very hold the old king had invented and forced him to submit. Rogers handed off the torch with his own finisher. That moment hardened into the single most famous philosophy in modern wrestling. The line Flair would repeat for the rest of his storied career. To be the man, you have to beat the man. Flair became the man by beating the man who created the role. Rogers spent his last wrestling years as an elder statesman, managing a stable of less charismatic talent in the territories, then returning to the company he had once led as champion to host an interview segment called Rogers' Corner, even helping turn the high-flying Jimmy Snuka into a beloved fan favorite. The arrogant young schisma had, with age, softened into a respected veteran, a living link back to the birth of the modern business. He never lost the hunger for one more moment in the lights. At 70, he agreed to a comeback match against a third Nature Boy, A younger wrestler named Buddy Landel, one final strut for old time's sake. The promotion folded before it could happen, and on June 26, 1992, Herman Gustav Rode Jr. suffered a massive stroke and died. 2 years later, the company he had once carried inducted him into its Hall of Fame. Strip away the robes and the bleach and the figure four and look at what actually happened here. A working-class kid from a German immigrant family in Camden, New Jersey, lost his father young, served in the Navy, and came home to walk a beat as a cop. There was nothing exotic about him. He had a magnificent body and an instinct, sharpened in circus tents, for the gap between a fight and a show. And from those plain beginnings, with no model to imitate because no model existed, he conjured something out of thin air that every great villain in his sport would spend the next 60 years copying. He invented the notion that a wrestler could be hated on purpose, that arrogance could be packaged and sold, that you could make a crowd pay to loathe you, and that their loathing was worth more than any cheer. He understood, before anyone, that wrestling was not a contest you watched, it was an emotion you bought. The strut, the bleach, the boast, the robe, none of it had anything to do with athletics. All of it was about feeling, about handing a paying crowd a perfect, gleaming, infuriating target for everything they longed to see torn down. The cop from Camden did not so much abandon his dream as discover that the ring was the only place vast enough to contain the performer the YMCA mats and the circus tents had quietly been assembling all along. He could not out-wrestle Lou Tesh. He never needed to. He out-imagined the entire business. So where does he actually rank? And you have to be honest, because the honest answer comes in layers. If the question is pure wrestling ability, Rogers does not top the list. And his rivals would tell you so at full volume. Lou Thesz, his great foil, was a more legitimate or technically accomplished grappler, a man who could genuinely wrench an opponent into submission. The establishment always regarded Thesz as the real article and Rogers as the flashy counterfeit. On craft alone, that argument has teeth, and he had a forerunner of his own. Before Rogers, there was Gorgeous George, the original glamorous showman, who first taught wrestling that a robe and a haughty sneer could draw a house. Rogers did not conjure showmanship from nothing. What he did was take the spark George struck and forge it into a complete, repeatable character, a villain built on arrogance and athleticism together, and then he turned that character into the single most valuable act in the sport. Something George never quite pulled off. But shift the question. Ask who was more influential, who pressed a deeper fingerprint into what wrestling became, and the debate is not remotely close. Lou Thesz, for all his greatness, founded no lineage. Buddy Rogers founded one. The cocky, strutting, sneering, peroxide blonde villain is today almost a cliché, and that is the ultimate proof of his reach. A thing copied so many thousands of times that it hardened into a stock character. Ric Flair built one of the most celebrated careers in history on his template and never once pretended otherwise. Buddy Landel took the name. The figure four leglock is still being cinched on in arenas around the world tonight. He is one of only 4 men ever to hold both of wrestling's foundational world titles. He is the first champion of WWE itself. And you have to be honest about the shadows too. The peers who shattered his arm in a dressing room did not do it for nothing. By many accounts, he was a genuine backstage operator who damaged careers and lived by that cold little motto about betraying his friends. The heart attack that ended his reign is argued over to this day, with the other man in the ring calling it a convenient fiction. Rogers was no saint. He was, fittingly, a great deal like the villains he invented, brilliant, magnetic, vain, and not entirely to be trusted. So how good was he, really? As a pure wrestler, very good, never the best, and openly resented as overrated by the men he beat. As a draw, one of the greatest of the entire century, a man who set records that stood for 20 years. And as an inventor, as the source code itself, he is essentially without peer. The honest verdict is the one that suits a man whose whole art was illusion. Buddy Rogers was not the greatest wrestler who ever lived. He was something rarer. He was the first. Everyone flashy who came after him is, knowingly or not, wearing his robe. The strut, the bleach, the boast, the robe, the figure four. A Camden cop dreamed them all up out of nothing, sold them to a country through a brand new television screen, and then handed the entire blueprint to a young man who would carry it further than the master ever could. That young man bleached his hair, learned the strut, stole the hold, and submitted his own idol in the middle of the ring to earn the name. Next time, we tell his story. How Ric Flair took a dying legend's gimmick and became, across 16 world titles and 40 years, the man you had to beat to be the man.